January 7th, 2023, just after midnight. After 15 ballots in several days, Republican Kevin McCarthy was elected Speaker of the House after Republicans took a very narrow majority in the House of Representatives. The Speaker of the House is the most powerful position in the House of Representatives and could be argued as the second most powerful person in America behind the President of the United States. 200 years ago, that man was Henry Clay. In the 1822 midterm elections, the Democratic-Republican Party had almost completely eradicated the Federalist Party. By the start of the 18th Congress on March 4, 1826, the Federalists had only 35 members in the House and Senate combined. In 1823, Henry Clay ran for the speakership for the third time, and he won that election, becoming getting another term as the Speaker of the House of Representatives. There were several major political figures in the upcoming Congress and the Congress. In New York was a 40-year-old senator named Martin Van Buren, who was elected in 1820. From Tennessee, there was a 55-year-old senator named Andrew Jackson, who was elected in 1822. And in Massachusetts was Congressman Dan Webster, who represented the 1st District of Massachusetts. Over at the White House, President James Monroe was not running for re-election this term. In 1824, 3 confidentials were in play for the election: John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State, John Calhoun, Secretary of War, and Secretary of Treasury William Crawford. All right, so in 1824, Adams was the Secretary of State at the time, and he played a very large role in the Monroe administration, such as setting up the Monroe Doctrine and other foreign policy agendas for President Monroe. Adams was the son of President John Adams, the only president to lose re-election up until that point.
John Quincy Adams followed a lot from his father's administration. He was minister to Russia in his father's administration, as well as many diplomatic positions afterwards. He was even elected to the U.S. Senate in the 1802 midterms.
Andrew Jackson, before becoming a senator, was a United States general during the War of 1812 against Great Britain and its other territories.
Andrew Jackson, as a 13-year-old teenager, fought in the American Revolution. In 1781, at the age of 15, he and his brother Robert was captured and taken in as a prisoner of war. While a prisoner of war, Jackson was slashed in the face by a British soldier after he refused to clean the soldier's shoe. This resulted in him in having a scar across the face for the rest of his life. After Jackson got released, his brother got smallpox while still in containment and shortly died right after. In 1802, Jackson was appointed the Major General of the Tennessee Militia, which he would lead in the War of 1812.
On January 15th, 1815, Jackson faced the British 5 miles south of downtown New Orleans. Jackson inflicted a defeat by overwhelming margins when he lost only 71 men, while the British lost over 2,000 men. A few weeks later, the treaty again took into effect, ending the War of 1812.
In 1816, the era of good feeling started in the United States. Monroe was elected president in 1816 and inherited the era of good feelings from President James Madison. Monroe was Secretary of State when the Tariff of 1816 was passed and when the Second Bank of the United States was opened. In 1820, there was a huge, conflict about slavery for the first time. Missouri was trying to become a state at this moment, and the states were divided to whether to allow slavery or not.
In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson and the Secretary of State, James Madison, bought the French Louisiana Territory from Napoleon for $15 million, which is $417 million in today's money. When Louisiana became a state on April 30th, 1812, the territory that was left was named the Missouri Territory.
In 1820, the Missouri Compromise was passed on March 5th and signed by Monroe on the 6th. The compromise agreed to add Missouri to the Union as a slave state and saw Maine to be added as a free state and barred no slaves north of the 3630 parallel line, which is the southern border of Missouri. The 10th presidential election is now underway. In October of 2023, after a compromise to keep the government open, Kevin McCarthy lost his job due to opposition on his right flank of the Republican Party. In 1823, the Democratic-Republican Party was now about to split into two. In December of 1823, the presidential campaign of 1824 was about to get underway. In Washington, D.C., President Monroe presented his Monroe Doctrine, written by Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. The occasion has been judged proper for asserting as principle in the rights and interests of the United States are involved that the American continents by free and independent convention, which they have been assumed and maintained henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. We owe it therefore to candor and to amicable relations existing between the United States and these powers to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. With the existing colonies and our dependencies of any European power, we have not interfered and shall not interfere, but with the governments who declared their independence and maintained it, and whose independence we have, on great consideration, on just principles and knowledge, we cannot control any in other manner their destiny by any European power in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition towards the United States of America. Alright, so the Monroe Doctrine basically said that European powers that that the United told European powers, that colonization in the Americas is opposed by the United States. As 1824 started, there were 6 candidates that were in the running. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, Secretary of War John Calhoun, Supreme Court Justice Smith Thompson, Treasury Secretary William Crawford, Speaker of the House Henry Clay, and Senator from Tennessee Andrew Jackson. In 1824, 66 of the 240 Democratic-Republican members of Congress met to nominate a candidate to succeed President Monroe.
The history of the nomination caucus is kind of short and sweet. It started in the early 1800s, where members of Congress met to nominate a candidate for president, and it obviously stopped in 1824 due to the Democratic Republicans being the only party at that point.
William H. Crawford was nominated at that nomination caucus, but again, it didn't matter. Jackson, Adams, Crawford, and Clay received some support across their respective regions. As election drew near, Thompson and Calhoun dropped out. Calhoun instead ran for vice president. As the campaign went on, songs and posters started to surface.
The Hunters of Kentucky was a song written to commemorate Andrew Jackson's victory at the Battle of New Orleans. Sometimes known as Half Horse and Half Alligator, the song was originally published in Boston in 1815. The song also commemorates the brave Kentuckians who fought alongside Andrew Jackson. The song covers themes of strength of the poor Kentucky man, bravery, propaganda, and how dirty the Battle of New Orleans actually was. Along with that, the song was used as a campaign song for Andrew Jackson's 1824 presidential campaign.
Voting for this election started on October 26, 1824, and lasted until December 2nd. This election marked a historic mark. Any male U.S. citizen aged over 21 years old was now eligible to vote in presidential elections. This was the first time states were decided via the popular vote.
Voting at that point in time was a bit complicated and very restrictive. First off, you had to be male, and because before the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, men were the only gender that was allowed to vote in an election. Second off, you had to be 21, because before the passage of the 26th Amendment in 1971, you had to be 21 to vote, instead of the now standard 18. And along with that, you had to be white, as before the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1869, only white males could vote.
The election was very competitive. Jackson won the popular vote by around 29,000 votes or over Adams and got 40.5% of the popular vote, compared to Adams receiving 32.7%.
The Electoral College is the system of voting in the United States used to decide who will become the next president of the United States. Typically, when the majority of a state's popular vote votes for one candidate in the election, usually the said candidate will receive the amount of electoral votes that the state offers for that one election. The Electoral College was created in 1787 as the result of the Constitutional Convention of 1787. At the time, the Electoral College was made up of 69 members, in which 35 were needed to win the election. In 1824, there were 261 members of the Electoral College, with Pennsylvania having the most, with 28 electoral votes.
To win the presidential election in the Electoral College, the required number was 131. Jackson won a plurality with 99 electoral votes, compared to Adams getting 84, Crawford's 41, and Clay's 37. Nobody got 131, which means that Congress decides who becomes president. The election had only just begun. January 6, 2021. A mob stormed the United States Capitol and delayed the Electoral College down after two objections. Joe Biden was certified as President of the United States in a congressional meeting that was not normal and very chaotic and nerving. 200 years ago, nobody knew what was going to happen on February 9th of 1825. The 18th Congress was in their final month when they convened on February 9th, 1825, when they voted on who would become the next president of the United States. With the rules of the 12th Amendment, only 3 candidates were to be decided from Jackson, Adams, and Crawford, with Clay eliminated from the race.
The 12th Amendment is as follows. The electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by the ballot for president and vice president, one of whom, at least, shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. The 12th Amendment was ratified through the U.S. Constitution in 1804, following an interesting outcome in the election of 1796. In that election, former Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson lost to then Vice President John Adams in a particularly close election, 71 to 68. However, there was a problem with this. In the Constitution, it states... Cut that out, Andy. In the Constitution, it states that whoever comes second in the election will act as the vice president to the president-elect. This means that a member of the opposing party will work under their opponent's administration as vice president, such as the case for Adams and Jefferson. Also under the Constitution, in regards to 1824, is the House of Representatives were to elect to the president in case of a tie or if no one gets a majority of the needed electors. And the Senate would decide the vice president under the same circumstances.
With Clay eliminated, he still had enormous power as Speaker of the House. By the time Congress reconvened after the election, the Democratic-Republican Party was split into two. The Adams-Clay coalition, which was turned into the National Republicans and Whigs, and the Democrats, who was decided Jackson, who ended up becoming the Democratic Party after the midterms. Speaker Clay despised Jackson. Clay saw an opportunity to strike a deal with Adams. Clay realized that the last 3 presidents had the same position, Secretary of State.
Thomas Jefferson was the first Secretary of State to become president in 1800 after defeating the incumbent John Adams. After serving 2 terms, his Secretary of State, James Madison, won the election of 1808. Just like Jefferson, Madison also served 2 terms, and his Secretary of State, James Monroe, ran and won the election of 1816, and just like his 2 predecessors, he served 2 terms.
Henry Clay sought the following deal with Adams: that Clay becomes Secretary of State in exchange for Clay and his side of the House voting for John Quincy Adams. When it came time to vote, Adams won the states that he had carried the fall, which is Maine, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, and flipped Kentucky, Missouri, and Ohio, which were carried by Clay, and 3 states won by Jackson, Illinois, Louisiana, and Maryland. Adams won 13 states to Jackson's 7, and he was elected the 6th President of the United States. When Adams was inaugurated, he officially appointed Clay as Secretary of State, and the controversy followed Adams and Clay in 1826 and 1828.
In the 1826 midterm elections, the Democrats won control of the House and Senate, and as such, they controlled Congress. In 1828, Adams lost re-election in a landslide to Jackson.
The 1824 election is one of my favorites, and it's one of the few elections in history that there was a deal to elect the President of the United States.
I personally think that the 1824 election is one of the most underrated elections in U.S. history. Yes, while 1800, 1912, 2000, and 2020 elections were more consequential, the 1824 election served as a reminder of how rules can be bent and how much of an impact it can cause on society.
1824 is the only election under the 12th Amendment that was decided by the House, but we've had elections that had multiple candidates win states in the election, for example, 1836, 1892, and 1912. The 1824 election was 200 years ago, but it's so interesting that 2 politics nerds and historians are right. But elections and democracy are fragile. That's why it's important to vote. I'm SPC, and I'll see you guys later.